Hey, welcome back. I'm Ralph Ranalli, your host for the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity podcast. One of the holy grails of politics and economics these days is a quote unquote good job. The problem is that surveys show that most people don't think they have one. In fact, as many as 60% of Americans who are currently working say that. So, where do we look for good jobs? For three successive presidencies, the answer has been the manufacturing sector. But Harvard economist Dani Rodrik says the evidence now shows that's wrong. It's a rethinking for Rodrik, the Ford Foundation professor of international political economy and co-founder of the Reimagining the Economy Program at Harvard Kennedy School, who in the past has seen manufacturing as a route to more equitable prosperity. But Rodrik says the evidence has changed, and it's changed his thinking. Despite investments and tariffs, factory work is just 8% of U.S. employment and falling, and even manufacturing powerhouses like China are bleeding millions of jobs in the sector. Now he sees the service industries as the most promising source of good jobs for the future, a position that puts him in the familiar position of outlier, since he was one of the earliest voices predicting the inevitable crash and burn of hyperglobalization. Rodrik admits it will be challenging to solve the big problem with service jobs, which is how to make them productive enough to support good wages and benefits. But he says we urgently need to start asking the right questions and to start experimenting with ways to make it happen. He joins me to explore those questions and how things like AI and public investment could factor into the answers. So let's get to it.
Dani, welcome. It's nice to see you.
Nice to be with you, Ralph.
So we're talking about how you see service sector jobs really as the future of the economy in terms of sort of rebuilding the middle class, reestablishing more equity, as opposed to manufacturing jobs. We've really seen, successive administrations pushing manufacturing as sort of like the panacea for the sort of job malaise we're going through, which makes you a bit of an outlier, which I think is a kind of a position you're somewhat used to. You were ahead of the curve on globalization, and I think that's why I enjoy working with you. Is I sort of see you as a early adopter of empirical reality. I guess that might be how I put it. Does this feel sort of like deja vu all over again for you? Because you are this is a significant shift in your thinking.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's sort of. I mean, I did for a significant part of my career. I worked on the importance of manufacturing, how promoting industrialization and manufacturing was critical for economic growth, development, strengthening the middle class. And so I've in the last 5-6 years, my ideas on the centrality of manufacturing have changed significantly. So as the saying goes, when the facts change, I change my views. What do you do, sir? I mean, it's so I think we're at an interesting point where policymakers are very reluctant to confront this reality. It's not that they're not aware of it, because if you push them on this, I think we have the experience in the United States now of 3 administrations, Trump 1, Biden, and then Trump 2, the first year or so of Trump 2, where there was a very concerted effort at trying to push a manufacturing revival in very different ways. Trump 1 was a kind of a baby version of Trump 2 with some tariffs. Biden, primarily not through tariffs, but through industrial policies that focused on advanced semiconductors and green
the CHIPS Act,
chips and the IRA and Build Back Better programs. And then Trump with this, sort of pushing tariffs through the roofs in his second coming. You look at what has happened to manufacturing jobs throughout all those 3 administrations, and they have just, you can't tell. It just have been continued to drift down. you look at the countries we're trying to emulate, mostly, China, which of course is the manufacturing powerhouse. And, China, of course, continues to increase its footprint in manufacturing on global markets, but employment is just plummeting in manufacturing by tens of millions in China. So there's a big disconnect that even if you're able to, um, you know, uh, engage some kind of a construction boom in manufacturing, reshore some parts of the manufacturing supply chains, that it's not going to show up in jobs. And that's sort of creates a conundrum. I mean, you don't want manufacturing to be a kind of an island in the economy in the same way that, oil is in the natural resource exporting countries, a kind of a very high value, sort of, but a kind of an island. And the rest of the economy is caught up in jobs that are, have been traditionally very poor. And for, the United States and other advanced countries, those are jobs in retail, in care, in food services. That's where a lot of the jobs of the future are. And so we need to confront that. I think policymakers, when you push them, they're aware that manufacturing is not going to be a source of jobs, and then the conversation then becomes of, but manufacturing is still important for national security, for the reliability of supply chains, for innovation in certain sectors, and I think all of that is right. But in terms of creating an inclusive economy and a cohesive society and restoring our middle class, we can't do it without focusing on where the jobs are going to be, and that's in services.
Right. Like, I mean, you agree that we can't just sort of forget about manufacturing. It has certain benefits that are important. Um, and is it right to
But let me
say,
just say this though. I mean, I think the downside, the cost of not making these distinctions about why is it that we care about manufacturing, is that then we overload the agenda for our industrial policies with manufacturing with a lot of goals and objectives that are simply not going to be met. We also open the door to a lot of very self-interested lobbying and rent seeking by manufacturing firms, because if they can latch on to this argument that, look, furniture production in the United States is very important, or garment production is very important, or autos and steel are very important because that's where we're going to sort of that's the foundation of our middle class and good jobs. You're giving them a voice, a salience, and influence in the political sphere that they do not deserve. So I think what's extremely important in making this distinction is that policymakers understand, yes, manufacturing is important for certain reasons, but we need to focus on what those reasons are. And first, therefore, keep our aims and goals, well targeted and selective when we're focusing on manufacturing. And second, let's keep a part of our mind and our focus on sort of the objectives of good jobs and the middle class, and that requires a distinct set of industrial policies. And if when we conflate those objectives, I think we're failing on both fronts.
right? I think, certain people have a tendency to see manufacturing as almost an end to itself, whereas the end really is good jobs, right?
Yeah.
But the definition, like you said this, right, that the definition of what is a good job is not necessarily easy to pin down. It's almost like the classic, oh, well, I know one when I see one kind of situation. But insofar as you can you tell me what your vision of a good job is?
Yeah, I think, a lot of it is, the best way to gauge what is a good job is actually sort of asking people. So we have surveys from from Pew and from other sources. When you ask people sort of what do they value in a job, what goes into determining the quality. A good part, of course, is obviously salaries, is the wages, is how much they pay. But there's a lot more than that. It's, there's a question about whether they're in control. They have a sense of agency and autonomy. Or do they control their schedules? Do they feel like what they say is being taken seriously, or are they being, simply treated as clogs in a machine? Are they part of just an intensified division of labor where they have no sense of what the picture is and everything is determined from headquarters? So a sense of, control, agency, autonomy, contribution to the work. I think that's how well they're treated by their superiors. That's another sort of, big uh, um, uh, uh, part of it. Another is a sense of career progression. That is there a possibility of advancement, that you can stay on the job and improve, become better at it, and then you will be rewarded at it. And that there is a sense that you can move up the ladder, and then finally, there's certain sense of job protections and job security and those aspects as well.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in your book that there was one survey which sort of asked 10 questions, sort of based on those criteria that you were just mentioning, and asked for responses in it. And I think the survey found that 60% of the respondents said they did not have a good job.
Yeah.
So it seems like we're really starting in a position where we're fairly far behind.
Yeah, today's, basically, these kinds of suggest about between 50 and 60% of the respondents tend to not think that they have a good job. If you ask them, if you lost your job today, what's the chance that you will find a good job? That likelihood is even lower. So there's a sense of foreboding, a sense of anxiety and worry about the future. And finally, I think just, reinforcing that is that, the incidence of bad jobs or low quality jobs is much higher precisely in the largest occupations of the future. Care, retail, warehousing, food services, and other personal services. And that's really my main concern, is that we're just not preparing for that world.
What's the fallout that we've already seen from the fact that so many people don't feel like they have a good job, they don't have the dignity of work? What sort of spillovers into other areas like the political sphere are a result of that?
I think the consequences go beyond simply just economic inequality. I mean, or high rates of joblessness. I mean, economists look at sort of what's happening to unemployment rates, or if you think that a lot of people are getting discouraged, what's happening to rates of joblessness among prime age workers. But those are sort of economic indicators. You can look at, there's work by sociologists, and my former colleague here, Bill Wilson, was one of the pioneers in this work when he was looked at what was happening in inner cities as a result of the disappearance of manufacturing jobs. And there are lots of social consequences in terms of family structure, family breakdown, increases in mortality, sort of addiction and increased use of opioids, increasing rates of crime. So there's all these, features of social anomaly, social enemy that sort of pervade society when good jobs tend to disappear. And then there are the political consequences. I think, localities and communities, regions where economic opportunities are becoming thinner on the ground are much more likely to be manipulated by demagogues, by extremists who are pointing to outsiders, whether they're immigrants or ethnic or religious minorities or foreign countries, sort of pointing them as the culprit. And I think it's very easy when in communities they face economic anxiety to turn it into a kind of a us versus them, zero-sum understanding of how the world works. And that, of course, leads to xenophobia. It leads to racism. It leads to political support for populists, and ultimately leads to a decline in support for democracy and increase in support for authoritarianism. And all of these things have been documented when in the recent economic literature, when you look at, for example, what are the consequences of the China trade shock in communities that have been most scarred by import competition. But of course, with sort of automation, and now with the AI revolution, it's just the China trade shock could easily be dwarfed by these other changes that are going to hit our markets if we don't take preemptive action or proactive about how we're developing and deploying technology.
Yeah. How much, I think you've said that you view economists maybe as sort of contributing to this issue in some way, in that they've sort of had I guess maybe smug would be the wrong word, but at least in a different attitude towards the societal effects of like job displacement.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I don't think economists are the instigators, but they are sort of like the reinforcers or the magnifiers of existing trends. And so economists are only too willing to, in general, to lend their authority to whatever existing trend is in the policy world. So I don't think actually economists are leaders in terms of. So when you go back, for example, historically, it wasn't. The fact that we got the social democratic settlement or the New Deal earlier in the United States, it wasn't really economists. It was just pragmatic policymakers reaching new arrangements. And then you have economists who are sort of justifying these things and working within that paradigm. Then we sort of have the neoliberalism after the 1990s. Yeah, I mean, economists were writing about, maybe the balance has gone too much in favor of the state, and we need to deregulate and we need to let markets work. But fundamentally, it wasn't them that were responsible for the transformation. It was the changing balance of power in society with financial interests, large corporations, multinational enterprises becoming much more sort of and I think it's the same now. I mean, now that the tide has changed, I think the general tenor of economic research has changed as well. But so we're I think if there's something to be said about economics in general, is that we tend to amplify existing fads rather than necessarily instigate those fads. We're not that important in terms of what determines policy and general orientations and general policy paradigms. There are, of course, exceptions. I think somebody like Keynes was critical, going somebody like Adam Smith. I mean, the ideas do make a difference. Or you look at, the influence of ideas about, compensation of managers and how sort of linking them to stock prices and, how that changed the ideas of how management compensation should change. That was very important. But it provides kind of an intellectual, scholarly foundation for, I think, something that was also already reflected in the balance of political power in society between corporations and the rest of us. So on the one hand, I don't think we've been as damaging as many people claim. It's the neoliberalism isn't economists' fault. On the other hand, I think we fall too easily into sort of the conventional wisdom of the time,
Right.
and start, become kind of a scholarly legitimizer of
Right.
that, and so.
Yeah, that sort of leads me to a question I wanted to ask about sort of societal perceptions and their sort of role in this, because it was interesting because on the last episode, I was talking to Ilyana Kuzyenko from Princeton and Suresh Naidu of Columbia, and we were talking about the Great Compression. But one of the things that they brought up was how there was sort of a mini compression during COVID, and how it was this upheaval that sort of exposed something. And to me, it exposed um, just how much the perception that service jobs um, were unimportant was a societal convention and not based in really reality. Because we went from sort of like not, ignoring the person who made us the sandwich to putting lawn signs on our lawn, thanking them and thanking the other service workers for their vital work. And it just showed you, to me, it showed how much do you think it's really just societal
Yeah,
perception? And does that give you hope that those things can
yeah,
change if they're not really that deep?
yeah. I think there's a lot to that. I mean, I think, we were talking earlier about, manufacturing, and sort of in people's mind, manufacturing is still thought of as sort of, the epitome of a good job, but it's actually not. I mean, it's, and,
Right. If I'm making somebody a
yeah,
sandwich and
yeah,
or in the healthcare sector or I'm feeding them, and in the healthcare sector, I'm
yeah,
helping someone be well and get
yes,
better.
yes,
How
yes,
is that less satisfying than, installing the same cylinder head over and over in a
right.
car engine, right?
Right. So a lot of it is in the public's mind and our social convention. So I think part of this transformation, I think, will have to be in that narrative, and the overall views of how important these service or care sector jobs are. So you need many things. You need, the changes in our societal narratives and our sense of values. Um, you know, the, you know, uh, but you need also changes in, um, we need innovations in both organizational setups and in the technologies that are used, because ultimately what made manufacturing um, something that lived up to its promise was that it could pay a lot. It could pay more than a service sector job because it entailed more productivity. And I think that's the other part of how we think about service jobs, is not simply deciding as a society, as we did during COVID, that we should value service sector workers more. They're doing incredible service for society. um, but that we need to create the ability as a society to pay them more. And that cannot happen simply by taxing the rest of the society so that we can pay them more. It will have to happen, as it did with manufacturing, with finding ways in which we can combine simultaneously increasing the quality of the work that is being done, increasing the autonomy, agency, earning of these workers, but also doing it through means that the quality of the service they're providing, the productivity with which they're working, is also enhanced. So that becomes then reinforcing, and you're not shifting the cost to consumers, or you're not shifting the cost to taxpayers, because otherwise, it becomes a purely distributive struggle between who's getting what. And the only way out of that is finding ways of deploying new types of organizations, new type of technologies that increases job quality, and service productivity simultaneously.
So is productivity the big challenge? And I actually like the way that you've approached this, because you're not saying, oh, I have all the answers. You're really more saying I'm asking maybe the right questions, because we don't have all the answers yet about
Yeah,
really how to solve this puzzle of making service sector jobs into what we need them to be societally.
yeah. So I think that's right. I think the first step is to start asking the questions in the first place. I do think we have some examples, and maybe I can talk about that a little bit. But starting to pose the question is very important. For example, you earlier mentioned, what does good job mean? Well, we actually, you know, we when we worry about GDP, or we worry about the economy, we come up with a measure called GDP, and then we actually measure it. When we worry about economic inequality, we come up with measures to measure it. So I think, if we worry enough about good jobs, we'll come up with measures to have a sense of what it is. So that's, getting your mind around it, is asking the question is the first step. And without that, you're really sort of swimming in abstractions, or in without enough focus. Um, uh, the other part is that, yes, we don't know. This is going to be difficult. But there are, lots of experiments and glimmers of evidence that should give us hope. For one thing, in many service sectors in the last decades or so, productivity has actually increased more, rapidly than in manufacturing. It's sort of manufacturing productivity that has stagnated in the United States, and productivity in jobs as in retail, in food services has actually, increased a lot. Now, the problem is that it doesn't necessarily show up in good jobs, because the manner in which productivity has been, enhanced is, by deploying technologies that intensify the division of labor, treat workers in a worse way, even if wages are somewhat higher at the lower end. So I think, because we have not as a society focused on how to deploy technology to help workers, as opposed to simply the employers. And then, in all of these sectors, there are, examples like in care. In the Dutch have a care sector where about 20% of care is provided by self-managed teams of about a dozen care workers that organize themselves. They've cut out the middle manager. They use technology to do their own sort of the billing, the organization, the management on their own. But they've cut out a lot of the fat on the management end that allows them to engage in a much more direct way with the people they're caring for. They have a lot of autonomy in deciding what they do, and it's a system that actually works very well. That delivers higher quality care, significantly reduces the cost of turnover, which was one of the biggest sources of low quality and low productivity in care, is the very high rate of turnover, which is reinforced by the low quality of work. And then you can break that cycle. You can do much better. And there are examples like such. The Dutch example I'm talking about is called the Buurtzorg. And the difficulty is that, it's very difficult necessarily to transplant those. I think every locality, every country has to start experimenting in its own way, find the kind of organizational models that will work well. And so that's where, you have to choose a policy direction to begin with.
Right.
We not presume that, we already know the answers before you're going to move in that way.
Yeah, and I think you said that sort of tucked into all that Biden manufacturing stimulation was actually a pretty decent beginning in terms of experimenting with models of this sort of
Yes.
innovation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think one of the Biden programs that I'm the biggest fan of was this the regional challenges. So they set up, I think, a couple of $1 billion under the Build Back Better program to essentially incentivize different localities to compete for these funds. And the basic message was, look, here's a pot of money. You can get some federal grants. If you're able to develop a local cross-sectoral alliance that might involve business leaders, workforce development leaders, the Chamber of Commerce, maybe your local community college or local university, develop a plan for how you're going to, move on in this world, and a new vision of economics for yourself, and tell us, where you will spend the money, and And so the idea was to, the money was the carrot, the incentive to get localities to develop and to coalesce around a set of goals and a vision for the type of economy that you want to be. And so I think that's a good model for the federal government to try to spur experimentation at the local level. It's an important beginning, but again, it falls short in many ways as well because first the amount of money was very low compared to, we're talking about a couple of $billions compared to $50+ billion on semiconductor manufacturing, or literally hundreds of billions of dollars in tax credits for IRA. And the second is, we still have to do work to do to understand what, this, term local capacity really means, because, what you want to do is essentially the communities that are lagging behind with loss of joblessness to be able to coalesce around these goals and develop the coalitions that can generate a vision and coordinate. And often the problem is not the lack of money, but the problem of that kind of local capacity. And so we don't know enough about what determines that capacity and how to develop it.
Yeah, but you did say one of the advantages of this service-based model is that it's a bottom-up strategy.
Yes.
And it might not be highly productive, but it's at least more productive, but it's also more inclusive.
Yeah.
Can you just sort of walk me through how that works?
Yeah, I think so. I was saying earlier that having a kind of a manufacturing focus, ultimately is sort of like having a vision of your economy that would turn it into a kind of a petro state. So what's the defining feature of a petro state is you have a very capital intensive, technologically advanced sector that produces a lot of value. That's a natural resource or oil, but which is really absorbing a tiny, tiny percentage of your labor force. And the hope that can provide, prosperity for the rest, for the 95% of the workforce that is not directly working in your, oil sector, is that you find mechanism of trickle down. Maybe you taxes and provide transfers, or you provide public sector jobs. You make work. And that's neither economically very attractive nor politically and socially very, very attractive model. It's a trickle down. It's a kind of an extreme form of a trickle down model. So ultimately, if you're an economy like today in the United States, 8% of the workforce is in manufacturing, and it's falling. So we're not so far. So if our focus is going to be on manufacturing. Essentially, it's going to be, developing our own version of a petro state, a very sort of tiny sliver of very productive, very capital intensive, technologically very advanced sector. And then we need to rely, on that sector to generate the resources to trickle down to the rest of. So, that's not a good model. So that's why I say that services, certainly you cannot get as rapid economic growth that you can in services as you can with a manufacturing focused strategy. The same way that an oil sector, an oil based economy can get rich overall much more rapidly by selling on world markets. But the question becomes, what about the rest of society? And so the trade-off is that you can create a more inclusive, more bottom-up, spread the benefits of productivity across a broader spectrum of workers, even if your overall GDP is not growing as rapidly.
So your petrostate example sounds suspiciously like what a lot of the sort of tech titans are predicting as the AI future, like
Exactly.
that very concentrated. Nobody's going to have to work anymore. We'll just give people some transfers or
Exactly. So
UBIs, and
that's why those people like UBI so much, because it's their answer, what will happen to the vast majority of people who have been displaced by these new technologies and AI? And their answer is, oh, they'll just get a transfer. They'll just get a check from the government. And, maybe I'm not, 100% against UBI. I think, in terms of setting a floor, it might have a role to play. I also don't think necessarily that everybody has to have a 35-hour, 40-hour job. I mean, I think we can have a lot of flexibility around that too. But a society in which basically all jobs have been replaced by AI or by machines, I think is a dystopian society.
How else do you think AI is going to affect the labor force in a way that is going to have like sort of economic and political ramifications for what you envision as the transfer to service jobs? Like I saw one estimate of 20% job loss among white collar, sort of lower level and entry level white collar workers over the next 5 years. First of all, do you put stock in those kind of estimates, or do you think they are sort of overblown? But do you see like a major shock kind of pushing this one way or the other?
I mean, it's definitely a major shock, but I think we make the mistake by framing the question as what will AI do to us, as opposed to how will we use AI. And I think that's I think a lot of these estimates and a lot of discussion around AI is framed around the question of what will be the consequence of AI? What will AI do to workers? What will AI do to us? Well, AI is a tool and can be used in very different ways, and how its use is under our control, should be under our control. And unlike robots or automation, for example, there's nothing inherent in AI that makes it labor displacing. With a robot, if you're just, putting a robot in a factory, it's just taking the place of workers. There's no other ways that you can. Even there, you have a certain amount of flexibility, as many manufacturers have found that it might be more productive to use, instead of, fully automated robots, use what's called collaborative robots, which are cobots, which are smaller and actually helping workers do their job and complementing what they're doing rather than simply taking their jobs away. But that idea applies in a much bigger way with AI, because AI, in principle, is able to provide the knowledge and experience and skills of the most sophisticated and the most experienced workers and make it available for those that are less skilled, less experienced. And so the whole idea with AI is actually it can make lower skilled workers, typically trapped in low quality jobs, might make them a lot more productive and give them the ability to do tasks and perform things that they weren't able to do before. So, for example, in care, which is again the big question mark here, because I always keep coming back to care because it's going to be the single biggest occupation in the United States and advanced countries. One model is you replace care with robots, sort of there to provide some version of assistance and humans touch with some kind of a robot. And some countries are actually trying to do that because of this perception of, there's a shortage of care workers. And so the way to go ahead is just put in robots. But of course, we don't have a shortage of care workers, really. We have a shortage of, high quality care jobs. And that's why people don't go into care. So with these new technologies like AI, it's possible to do things like, point of care diagnostics, where sort of care workers are engaging in the type of jobs, in the type of work that previously only a registered nurse or a nurse practitioner or even maybe a physician might have been able to do. But now they have on their fingertips the tools of AI to make decisions and to engage in diagnostics that they would not have been able to do, maybe in connection with some kind of a remote operator who might have sort of more education and skills and so forth. But we can reimagine all these jobs in ways using AI that actually turn them into more productive, sort of higher quality jobs while increasing the productivity of service. But we will need to, invest in thinking along those ways because it's not quite clear that employers or the innovators have the incentive to do so.
Right. So I think that's the other $64,000 question is how do what mechanism is there to assert some public or regulatory control to push these technologies in a way that make them more worker friendly, more worker enhancing, as opposed to just simply worker displacing and inequality enhancing? Is that the government? Is that
Yeah. So I
what
think,
other?
yeah, I mean, I think we need to, you know, so the the details depend very much on the type of sector we're talking about, and also the country context. But there's two broad areas where we need to move in. One is clearly, enhanced worker voice. So, even in manufacturing, you did not get the benefits of higher productivity showing up in higher wages and better work conditions until workers got organized and you got unions and collective bargaining. So that's absolutely a must. Workers have to have a voice in the way that, organizations work and the management of work, the organization of work, the type of technologies that are deployed and how they work. So that's number one. The number two is you do need, I think, a kind of a public push, a dedicated push in investment in the types of technologies that are, from the get-go worker friendly. So that's, I think, we have the DARPA-ARPA scheme in the United States where, the public sector very effectively invests in frontier technologies with clear, dedicated goals in mind. Of course, it started with defense-related technologies with DARPA. That was the origin. But then we have newer versions in energy efficiency, or we have it in public health. And so I think we need a version of that that's also sort of focusing on worker-friendly technologies in these all sort of very large occupations, and to work with the, sort of the start from how can we, you know, uh, develop and disseminate these kinds of technologies that are going to enable service sector workers to increase quality of service, increase the scope of decision making autonomy that they have access to, increase the range of tasks that they're able to perform, and work with industry and technology stakeholders to sort of get them to think in those terms. I think that's where, a public sector initiative along ARPA lines, I think, is extremely important.
Yeah, I think you called it ARPA-W.
Yeah.
Um, at what levels do you think of government do you think that's feasible right now? Because I mean, I think what we're seeing is sort of the opposite. We're not seeing government dictate to sort of the tech sector. We're really seeing the tech sector dictating to
Yeah.
government. Um, and so does it happen at the state and local level, or do you think there's a political, like say there is a big AI um, upheaval, a lot of people lose their jobs to AI. Do you think that could drive some sort of um, societal movement, that would sort of tip the balance back towards public control of these kinds of technologies?
I think a lot can be done at the state or local level, like in the care. I think states have a lot of discretion on how they're deploying Medicare, for example, and they can certainly work with local providers to promote the kind of organization innovation that would focus on increasing the quality of care work, to reducing turnover, within the parameters that are set by the federal rules. But ultimately, I think the federal government and national governments, typically in the European Union, will have to take the lead on this because of scale and and their ability to deploy resources. And yes, there I do think that we will need a kind of it's the equivalent of how we got a backlash against hyperglobalization. I think we're going to get a backlash against tech control of our national policy agenda. I don't think it's going to happen under the current administration, but it's possible that it'll happen in a future administration.
And finally, do you see a role? Because again, when I was talking to Suresh and Ileana, and we were talking about the Great Compression, and particularly it was non-R&D spending on military procurement that played a significant role in sort of the Great Compression's flattening of of inequality and creating sort of a robust middle class. Do you think there is a role for government, not just regulation, but direct government investment, say like a Medicare for all, where the government really did step into the healthcare sector and did things like raise wages and force like the implementation of worker enhancing technologies? What do you see as the government's role there?
Certainly in care, the government has a huge role because it's already so deeply entangled in the sector that it has an incredible ability to set the rules in terms of the quality, the level of quality. The problem, again, going back to our earlier discussion, the government cannot simply mandate, higher quality jobs without running into problems. And the only way you can mandate higher quality jobs and those conditions is to also enable the conditions under which those higher quality jobs can be provided without pushing costs either onto the taxpayers or to the recipients of these services. And that's where I think that kind of technology push, comes into play. And I think with its, incredible role in terms of setting the rules, in terms of being, the procurement, government has the ability to stimulate those new technologies and put them into place. But it does require for us to start thinking about those sectors in productivist terms and not simply, in terms of a shortage of care workers, which is still how the problem is framed, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, Dani. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I think an important one, a sort of important conversational thread to open up, sort of on a broader level. And I hope we've done a little bit in that regard today, and that it grows. And I really look forward to revisiting this with you sometime in the future because it's really an interesting topic.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. This podcast is a production of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, a network of leading economists looking beyond neoliberalism and economic nationalism to answer the question, how do we build a more inclusive, more sustainable, and more prosperous economy for everyone? Our show is produced in collaboration with the Reimagining the Economy Project at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. The co-producer of this podcast is Tony Ditta. Please join us again in 2 weeks for another episode. And if you like our content, please share us on social media and remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or YouTube or your favorite podcasting app.